There is a kind of confusion that does not have a good name. It is not heartbreak exactly. It is not betrayal exactly. It is something in between. It is the feeling you get when someone you have known for years, someone you trusted, someone you thought you understood, suddenly starts acting like a completely different person. And you stand there thinking, who is this? Where did the person I knew go? And more importantly, was that person ever really there at all? Maybe it was a friendship that went 20, 30, 40 years, through children, through moves, through hard times and good ones. And then something shifted. An inheritance, a retirement, a falling out over something that seemed small, or nothing at all. Just a slow, quiet change you noticed one day without being able to point to the exact moment it started. Maybe it was a sibling who was close to you your whole adult life and then became a stranger after your parents passed away. Maybe it was a neighbor who was warm and dependable for a decade and then one day just wasn't. Maybe it was someone at your church, your club, your social group, someone you would have described as a good friend, who turned in a way that left you genuinely bewildered. If any of that sounds familiar, you are in exactly the right place today. Because Carl Jung had a very specific and very useful way of understanding why this happens, and by the end of this conversation, I think two things are going to change for you. First, the confusion is going to lift a little, because this thing that happened to you is not as mysterious as it feels. There are real understandable reasons for it. Second, and this one takes a little longer to settle in, you might start to see the situation slightly differently than you did when you clicked on this video. But before we get into any of that, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to drop this in the comments, because I think the conversation below this video is going to be one worth reading. Has someone you trusted for years changed in a way you did not see coming? Not a dramatic falling out, just a slow shift that left you wondering who this person had become. When did you first notice it? Was it something they said? The way they treated you differently? A decision they made that surprised you? Tell me below. Because I have a feeling a lot of people watching this have been sitting with this quietly and have never had anyone explain it to them in a way that actually made sense. All right, let us get into it. Reason 1. Life changed the conditions, and the conditions were holding things together. Here is the first thing worth understanding, and it is the one that explains more situations than almost anything else on this list. A lot of relationships are held together, not just by genuine affection, but by shared circumstances. Shared struggle, shared routine, shared geography, shared stage of life. And when those shared circumstances change, the relationship sometimes changes with them. Think about the friendships that formed at work. 30 years of coffee in the break room, shared frustrations, inside jokes, someone to eat lunch with, real warmth, genuine care. But the glue holding it together was the shared circumstance of being in that building together 5 days a week. Retirement comes. The shared circumstance disappears. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes you discover that what felt like a deep friendship was actually a very good situational friendship. The warmth was real, but the roots were not as deep as they appeared when the conditions were right. A woman named Carol described this exactly. She had a work friend named Patsy for 22 years, lunch every Wednesday. They talked about everything. Carol would have called Patsy one of her closest friends without hesitation. Then Carol retired. The first few months they stayed in touch, texts, occasional lunches, but gradually the lunches got harder to schedule. The texts came less often. Within a year they were down to Christmas cards. Carol was hurt. She felt like Patsy had changed. But what Carol eventually understood is that Patsy had not changed. The circumstances had. And without the circumstances, what remained was a genuine but situational friendship that was never quite built to survive outside the building it was born in. That does not mean the friendship was fake. It was real. It meant something. But some friendships are seasonal, and there is no villain in a season changing. Reason 2. Something happened that showed you who they always were. Now, here is the one that takes a while to sit with. Sometimes people do not actually change. Sometimes what happens is that something, a stress, a loss, a windfall, a falling out, a moment of real pressure, removes the conditions that allowed them to be their best self around you. And what you see afterward is not a new person. It is the person who was always there underneath. Carl Jung had a concept he called the persona, the social mask. The version of ourselves we present to the world, polished, agreeable, kind, generous, dependable. Most of us have one. It is not exactly fake. We really are trying to be those things, but it takes conditions to maintain. When life is comfortable, the persona holds. When there is nothing to compete over, nothing to lose, nothing to fear, most people are capable of being their best version. They are patient and warm and supportive. But put real pressure on the situation. Money, inheritance, recognition, their sense of status in the family, their fear of being left out or left behind, and the persona starts to crack. And what comes out from underneath is not always what you expected. I want you to meet a man named Harold. Harold had a brother named Clifton. Close their whole adult lives. Holidays together, fishing trips, phone calls every Sunday. Harold would have said Clifton was the most reliable person he knew. Their mother passed away when Harold was 71. Left behind a house and some savings. Not a fortune, but enough. Within 3 months, Harold barely recognized his brother. Clifton became suspicious about the estate. Started questioning Harold's memory of conversations. Got an attorney involved. Said things Harold would have bet his life Clifton would never say. Harold kept asking, what happened to him? What changed? A mutual friend eventually said something that stopped Harold cold. She said, Harold, nothing happened to Clifton. You just never had anything worth fighting over before. She was right. In 40 years, the conditions had never activated that part of Clifton. There had never been money on the table. There had never been a reason for the part of him that feared not getting his share to show up. The conditions changed. The persona cracked, and Harold found out who his brother actually was underneath the Sunday phone calls and the fishing trips. That is painful. One of the most painful things a person can experience. But there is something clarifying about it too. Harold did not lose who he thought Clifton was. He found out who Clifton actually was. And those are different things. You cannot lose something that was not there. You can only find out it was not there. Jung believed that the most important journey a person can take is toward seeing reality clearly, including the reality of who the people in your life actually are. Not who you need them to be. Not who they appear to be when conditions are favorable. Who they actually are. That clarity is painful, and it is also a gift. Reason 3. Your own growth changed the dynamic. Now here is a reason people almost never consider, and it is one of the most interesting ones. Sometimes the person who changed is not them. It is you. Not in a way that is your fault, but your own growth, your healing, your new boundaries, your increasing clarity about what you will and will not accept can change a relationship just as significantly as anything the other person does. Some relationships are built on a particular dynamic, an imbalance. One person a little more confident, the other more accommodating. One the advice giver, the other the receiver, both getting something from it. That can feel like deep friendship. But when the more accommodating person starts accommodating less, when you start saying no where you used to say yes, when you stop laughing at the joke that was always a little too pointed, the other person can experience that as you changing, as something being off. What actually happened is that the balance they were accustomed to shifted. A woman named Elaine went through this with a friend she had known for over 30 years. The friendship had always had a certain shape. Her friend talked. Elaine listened. Her friend had opinions. Elaine deferred. And it worked, until Elaine stopped making herself smaller than she needed to. A health scare, a period of real reflection, a decision to start valuing her own time and energy differently. Elaine started sharing her own opinions, started saying when she did not have time for certain conversations, stopped automatically agreeing, and her friend, who had genuinely loved Elaine for 30 years, started to find her difficult, started to say that Elaine had changed, started to pull back. From the friend's perspective, something had shifted, and she did not know what. From Elaine's perspective, she had simply started showing up as herself. Neither woman was the villain, but the friendship had been built on a dynamic that Elaine's growth disrupted, and the friendship, in that particular form, did not survive it. If you have grown in recent years, some relationships may loosen. That is not always a sign that something went wrong. The ones built on who you actually are will hold. The ones built on a smaller version of you may not. And that is painful. But it is also, in its way, a kind of answer. Reason 4. Loss and age changed what they are able to give. This fourth reason is the gentlest one, and the most important one to hold on to if you want to extend grace to someone without excusing everything. People change under loss. Real loss. The death of a spouse. The loss of health. The loss of a role they had identified with for decades. The loss of independence. The loss of a parent, which no matter how old you are when it happens, leaves behind a particular kind of grief and a particular kind of rearrangement inside a person. Loss changes people, not always for the worse, but always. And sometimes what looks like a person turning cold or distant or difficult is actually a person who is grieving something you did not know they were grieving, or carrying something they have not found the words to name. A man named Walter had a neighbor named Ed, good friends for 15 years. Barbecues, shared tools, conversations over the fence that sometimes went an hour without either of them noticing. Ed was one of the warmest people Walter knew. Then Ed's wife passed away. Over the following year, Ed became someone Walter did not quite recognize. Quieter, shorter in conversation, and when he did come outside, sometimes a little sharp, a little quick to take offense at things that would not have bothered him before. Walter was confused. He tried to give Ed space. He tried to reach out. He tried several approaches, none of which seemed to hit quite right. What Walter eventually came to understand, slowly through his own experience of loss later on, is that grief does not just make people sad. It rearranges them. It takes things out of order. Things that used to be easy become hard. Patience that used to come naturally runs short. Warmth that was always available suddenly requires energy that grief has spent. Ed had not changed in any fundamental way. Ed was still Ed. But Ed was carrying something so heavy that being the version of himself Walter was used to, easy, warm, present, was simply more than he had available right now. That does not mean Walter had to absorb difficult behavior indefinitely, but it changed how he understood it, and it changed what he thought the situation called for. Not space, not distance, just patience, and an occasional knock on the door that said, "I am still here if you want company." Jung believed that loss and age do something specific to people. They pull back the persona, the polished social version, and leave behind something more raw, more honest, and sometimes more difficult. What you see in an older person who is grieving or struggling is often closer to who they really are than anything you saw in the comfortable years. And that version deserves to be met with patience, even when it is harder to be around. Now here is the thing that ties all four of these together, and it is not quite what you might expect. People do not actually change as much as it seems. What changes is the conditions, and the conditions were doing more of the work than you knew. When life is comfortable, most people can be their best version. Warm, generous, patient, dependable. You see that version for years and come to believe that is who they are. Then something shifts. The money arrives. The loss comes. The retirement happens. Your own growth disturbs the balance, and a different version appears, one you did not expect. But that version was always there. It was just waiting for the right conditions to become visible. Jung said that pressure does not create character, it reveals character. What you find out about someone under real pressure is not something new. It is something that was always there. And there is something clarifying about that. Eventually. You did not lose who you thought they were. You found out who they actually are. Finding out the truth, even a painful truth, is always better than living inside an illusion that was going to crack anyway. Now, understanding this helps. But let us be practical for a moment. If you are in the middle of this right now, if there is someone in your life who has shifted in a way that hurt or confused you, here is what actually helps. First, give it time before you make any permanent decision, not endless time. But enough to see whether what you are witnessing is a temporary disruption, grief, stress, a hard season, or a more permanent reveal of who this person actually is. Those are different situations, and they call for different responses. Second, stop trying to get back to the old version. The old version existed in old conditions. Those conditions are gone. If the relationship is going to survive, it will survive as something slightly new. Two older, more complicated people meeting each other honestly. That can actually be better than what came before, but it requires letting go of the expectation that things will go back to exactly how they were. Third, be honest with yourself about what you are willing to carry. Grace is a beautiful thing. Patience is a virtue. But neither of them requires you to remain indefinitely in the front row of ongoing cruelty or mistreatment. You can understand why someone is behaving badly and still decide the answer is some distance. And fourth, grieve it if you need to. Even if the relationship continues, the version of it you had is gone. And that is worth grieving. Honestly, not forever, but honestly, because pretending a loss is not a loss is just another way of not dealing with it. Some relationships survive the storm, some relationships were only the weather, and that is a hard thing to sit with, but sitting with it honestly is how you eventually get to the other side of it. Here is the question I want to leave you with today, and I truly hope you will share your answer below. Has someone you trusted for years changed or revealed themselves in a way that surprised you? Looking back on it now, which of these 4 reasons do you think was behind it? Changed circumstances, pressure revealing who they always were, your own growth disrupting the balance, loss changing what they were able to give? Tell me in the comments. This one is going to be a real conversation. And if this helped you make sense of something that has been sitting uneasily in the back of your mind, please share it with someone else who might need it today. Sometimes all a person needs is for something confusing to finally make sense. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.